Car's Garage. In this video, I'm going to be working on the Team Associated B6.3 and I'll be assembling bag 9. Let's get started. So bag 9 was actually in this big bag and we had to open up a few different bags to get parts for the other steps. So be careful when getting things out and not to lose any of the small parts. I'll be using my buggy stand slash shock building stand that I designed. I put that up on Thingiverse so you can go check out that file and 3D print it if you have a 3D printer. In addition to bag 9, you'll be needing your shock fluids that are included. So you've got 35 weight, 45 weight, and since I don't have any green slime, which they recommend using on some of the seals, I'm just going to be using the black grease that they provided to lubricate some of those seals and O-rings. So I'll build one front shock and one rear shock because the other one's going to be an exact build, just to kind of shorten the video up. But let's work on one of the rears first. And I'll get a front one there. So what we'll need, make sure you have a clean area for all your O-rings and stuff. You don't want any dirt getting into them. So you have 2 length shafts. One's longer, one's shorter. The longer one's going to go in the rear and the shorter one's going to go in the back. Same with the body, the shock bodies. One's longer, one's shorter. The longer one's going to be the one in the back. So since we're going to start with the one in the rear, we're going to use the longer shock shaft. So we need a 2.5 millimeter washer. We're going to put that on the shaft first. And then we're going to use the 12 millimeter V2 shock piston. It has 2 by 1.6 holes and it's flat. So looking at the shock pistons, you'll notice that the front ones are labeled 1.5 and the rear ones are going to be labeled 1.6. So let me show you that. Might be hard to see on the light with the lighting, but yeah, it's going to be hard to see with the lighting. And you could probably use a Sharpie or a pen so that way you can see that more easily. But I'm just going to leave it as it is. And you want to install it with the number facing up. And then you'll take the M2 by 4 millimeter screw and tighten that up. No Loctite is recommended, just in case you gotta take it off. This small screw you can easily strip, and don't over tighten it because if you strip out the head, it's going to be almost impossible to remove it. And this is where a shock tool comes in handy, because you can grab onto the shock shaft and not mar it up. There you go. So the shaft is ready. Now we gotta prepare the shock body. So we have on the bottom, we're going to rub the shock oil lightly on the O-rings before we install it. And the rear shock gets 35 weight, so I'm just going to use a 35 weight. Oil on the smaller O-rings that they have in the kit. So just put a little dab on there and rub it on to the O-ring and lubricate it, so that way when you install it, it doesn't get damaged. It installs on the bottom like that. And then we're going to need looks like the V2 shock hat bushing. There's 2 of those. And so those bushings are these pieces here. And then we need a shock spacer, which is the thicker piece off the parts tree. And then I'm going to trim this piece. Be careful when trimming it, because it is a very small piece and it's kind of hard to hold. So it looks like the shock hat bushing has a larger diameter and a smaller diameter. The smaller diameter is going to go into the shock first, and then we're going to install the X-ring, and I'm going to put a little bit of grease on that. So install that X-ring next. Then we'll install the V2 shock spacer, which is the thicker piece we got off the parts tree. Then we're going to install another X-ring with a little bit of grease on that. Then we're going to install the shock hat bushing, and this time the smaller diameter is going to be facing up in this orientation. Okay, now we can install the shock bottom cap, which is this aluminum anodized piece. And just hand tighten it, and that should be plenty. Now we can install the shock shaft, and I'm going to rub a little bit of grease on there to help install it a little easier and hopefully prevent it from nicking any of the O-rings. So I'm just going to put some grease on the threads as well. That'll help with the installation of the shock eyelet. So now you can install the shock shaft and piston, and that was smooth. There's no stiction or anything like that. So that feels pretty good to me. Now for the back, we're on step 2 of bag 9. We're going to install one nylon spacer in the rear. There's no nylon spacers that go in the front. And that nylon spacer is going to be this clear piece here that was in the bag of the O-rings. So I'll install that. And there are 3 shock eyelets that are shown, but it looks like only 2 different sizes come in the kit. In the rear, you use the longer of the 2, which is what they call the +2 millimeter, which is this piece here. So I'm going to trim that real quick. And then I'm going to install a pivot ball. And then I'm going to install this onto the shock shaft. So what I'm going to check now is that the rear shock is supposed to have 28 millimeters of stroke. That is from the bottom to the shock eyelet. So I'm a little long, so I'm going to thread the shock eyelet in just a bit more. And then remeasure. And I'm right at 28 millimeters. Now, what we can do is filling up the shock with shock fluid and bleeding it. So before we do that, I'm going to add a little bit of shock fluid to this O-ring. That's going to seal the top cap and install that first. Next, I'm going to prepare a shock cap. So what's recommended is to actually thread in the M2 by 4mm screw into the shock cap, or at least get it started in the first 2 threads, so that way when you do install it later on, when it's full of shock fluid, that you don't spill any extra out. And you just get maybe 1 or 2 turns into the shock cap and then remove the screw. Okay. So there's that. Now what we're gonna do is, the rear takes 35 weight. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill up the shock body about 3/4 full. And then I'm going to cycle a shock almost all the way up to the top of the fluid and then back down to get any air that's trapped underneath the piston to come up. I'll do that a few times, and actually might be able to show you the bubbles that are coming up. So cycle it a few times. You'll see some bubbles in there. And what I like to do is I'll let that rest for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the weight of the fluid, to make sure all the bubbles come to the top and escape. So while we wait for that, I'm gonna go ahead and start on the front shock. So again, take the 2.5mm washer, and since it's a front shock, we're going to use the 1.5 piston, and remember, lettering facing up. I'm going to install the screw without Loctite. So that's ready. Now we can get the shock, the bottom of it ready. So we're going to take the small O-ring, and since it's going to use 45 weight shock oil, I'll just use that. So a little bit of shock fluid on the O-ring. And then again, we're going to need the shock hat bushings, 2 of them, and 1 of the shock spacers, which is the thicker piece. Trim if needed, and remember again, it's a small part, so be careful you don't cut yourself. There's not much trimming needed, as they came off fairly well on mine. So in this orientation, the smaller diameter piece of the shock hat bushing is going to be facing down. And then we're going to install the X-ring, and I'm going to put a little bit of grease on that. Then what's next is the shock spacer. Then another X-ring with some grease. Then the last shock hat bushing, and this time in this orientation, as I'm installing it, the smaller diameter is going to be facing up. And then finally, you can take the shock bottom cap and thread it on. And you can use the turnbuckle wrench that they supplied to hold the shock body and make sure that shock bottom cap is tight. Next, we can install the shock shaft, and I'm going to put a little bit of grease on there, on the threads, and then, on the threads, and then kind of work some of it onto the shaft to make it easy to install, and then make sure that it does not hurt the O-ring and anything like that. And that's beautiful. No stiction, great feel. So the rear shaft, the front shock, sorry. The front shock requires the shorter shock eyelet. So I'll trim that real quick. And we'll install a pivot ball. So I thread it on until I can't see any threads. Remember, the front shock does not require the nylon spacer, and the front shock stroke is 24 millimeters. So with it fully extended, you can measure using your digital caliper. And we're at 22 millimeters, so I will need to back off this shock eyelet. Okay, at 24 millimeters now. So now, since the front takes 45 weight shock fluid, I'm gonna fill up the shock body 3/4 of the way. Then I will cycle the shock up almost to the top of the fluid and then back down to get any air trapped underneath the piston above. And I'll cycle it a few times, try to get as much air out, and then I will let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes. Let me add a little bit of fluid onto this O-ring for the top cap. Now we can return to the rear shock. It looks like all the air bubbles are gone. And what we do now in order to bleed the shock is fill it all the way up with the 35 weight shock fluid. And then so now we're gonna add some of the shock fluid, just a drop into the cap, and put some on the threads. And this is gonna get a bit messy, so make sure you have a rag on hand. But what we're gonna do now is bleed the shock, and in order to do that, just hold the shock in a rag and install the cap. And you're gonna have we'll start having excess fluid coming out of that top hole. So now what you're gonna wanna do is hold the shock at an angle with the bleeder hole facing up, and you're gonna slowly compress the shock. And then you're going to install the bleeder screw. And remember, you're going into plastic, so you do not want to tighten it down too hard and strip out the plastic shock cap. There we go. And then wipe off any excess shock fluid. Now we can do the same thing for the front. So it's been sitting a while. You can do a few more strokes. Make sure there's no more air bubbles. I don't see any more. So I'll be filling it up. We're gonna prep this shock cap the same way. Just gonna take the bleeder screw and do 2 turns or so, and then back it out. That way it'll be easier to install once we have the shock cap on. And again, you're gonna put a drop in the shock cap and then put a few drops onto the threads. Then install the shock cap. Remember, this part's going to get messy, so have that rag on hand. And now, again, you're going to face that bleeder screw up and slowly compress the shock. And when the shock is fully compressed, install the bleeder screw. And remember, you're going into plastic, so don't tighten it too much. As soon as you feel it shoulder up, that's good. And then wipe off any excess fluid. And the shock is built. Now I can put on the springs and the collars and the spring cups. And then we can install it onto the car. So I'm going to build the other 2 shocks off camera real quick, and then we'll continue. Alright, so we're not done bleeding the shocks just yet. So the shock bleeding steps that they have in the instruction manuals kind of gets you halfway, and then follow these instructions to get the shocks where they should be, where they're dead. And I'll show you what that means. Basically, after you're done building your shock, you want to pump it up a few times, and then you'll see that the shock shaft comes out a little bit. So we don't want that. We want it to be dead, whereas you put it in and it stays in, or If it's all the way out, it stays out. It doesn't get sucked back in like this one is. So what we're gonna do is you pump it up a few times, and then we're gonna bleed it again. So take out your bleed screw. And then slowly compress it until some of that shock fluid comes out. And then reinstall the bleed screw. And don't over tighten it again. Since it's going into plastic, you just want it to shoulder out. So wipe any excess that came out. And then we can do that step again. Pump it up. And you see it doesn't want to come out. So that's what you want with all the shocks. And repeat that until you get that type of movement, and do that to all your shocks. All right, now we can move on. Okay, so now with the shocks filled and bled, we can assemble the shocks with the springs and the spring cut along with the collars. So first thing we need to do is take the threaded collar and take one of these O-rings, and the O-ring goes inside the collar. And so you carefully need to install it inside the groove in the collar. And then you can add some silicone oil to that O-ring and spread it around, because that'll help install the shock collar, and it'll prevent that O-ring from getting torn up. So on the front shock, we have to have a gap of 4.2 millimeters from this surface to this surface. So once we get close, I'll measure it with my calipers and adjust as needed. So I'm at 6.58. A few more turns. 5.67. 4.9. 4.4. 4.17 and 4.2. So now the front spring is the shorter one and it has the red color on it. Before we move on, one of the issues I have with the shock is that when the shock eyelet is on, you can still see some threads. So that makes me believe that the way it's designed and the amount of stroke it needs isn't quite correct. And this might be a failure point moving forward because that shock shaft isn't as far into the eyelet as it should be. So that's the spring that goes on, and the spring cup, there's 3 different ones, and there's a short one, the like medium sized, and then a much larger one. So in the front, we use the medium sized one. And to install the spring cup, basically compress the spring and install onto the shock shaft. And then the spring cup will actually go over and shoulder out onto the shock eyelet. And one of my complaints here is that with the shock fully extended, the spring is not compressed at all with the stock setup. So I feel like something is going on here. Maybe the shock travel isn't quite what they want it to be. If the eyelet was on more and using up all the threads, then the spring wouldn't move around when it's fully extended. So that's my issue there. I'll probably ask around and see what other people locally have been doing and if they have the same issue. Now for the rear shock, a few things are going to be different. The distance from the top of the shock to this shock collar is going to be 8.7 millimeters versus the 4.2 that was in the front. And also for the spring cup, we're going to be using the short one, which is the 0 millimeter. instead of the 5. So keep a note of that. So we're at 10.8. 9.6, 9.1, 8.7. And the rear spring is the blue spring, so you can put that on. And the shock collar, the spring cup I mean, is the 0mm one. So trim that real quick. And the same way to install the spring cup, just compress that spring a little bit and install the collar onto the shock shaft. And that spring cup will push it down and it will shoulder out onto the shock eyelet. So the rear spring with the shock fully extended, the shock is compressed a little bit and does not have any play. So now we can move on to installing the shocks onto the chassis itself. So we'll start with the front, and it actually shows the bleeder screw facing the inside of the car, but I don't think it really matters, and I'm going to be facing it towards the outside of the car. The one thing that kind of bothers me is that the shock cap doesn't pop into the shock mount in the top where it's supposed to be like a ball, like a pivot ball. And I mean, there's a little bit of play there, but when you install the nut, the shock can still move back and forth. So it's one of my concerns. I'll ask around locally and see if other people are having that problem. Please put in the comments if that's an issue that you're seeing as well. I can see that being problematic in terms of performance. And this nut shoulders out onto that, so you don't need to crank down on it, but as you can see, the shock does move around. So I don't think that's a good design. I think something might be wrong there. So I'll be asking around to see if something's wrong with my kit or if that is the actual way that it's designed. And we'll go from there, and I'll try to report back either with another video or in the comments below. So it doesn't say which way to put the pivot ball, but I'm going to face the flange towards the head of the screw. And we're going to install the M3 by 20 millimeter screw on the outside hole in the front arm. Remember, you're going into plastic, so you don't need to tighten it down too hard. As soon as the head of the screw shoulders up, you're good. Now onto the rears. Have a very similar issue on the pivot ball on the top of the shock tower. It doesn't pop into place and it just kind of moves around. I feel like there's an issue there, but I'll install it as it is now and then ask around locally and report back to you guys. And this lock nut shoulders out on the blue anodized piece, so you don't need to worry about tightening it down too hard. As soon as it shoulders up, you're good. On the bottom, you want the flange on the pivot ball towards the arm. So you have a larger side and a smaller side, so you want the larger side, which is the flange, to be against the arm. And then we'll add the lock nut onto the bottom, and that side will be done. This side has the same problem that all the other ones were having. The shock cap just slides around in the mounting spot. So the suspension is on, the shocks are on. Just concerned about the shock mounting points at the top, that they move around quite a bit. I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be or not. It doesn't seem right to me, and I'll do some more investigating about that. If you guys have any comments about your kits, if it does that, please let me know. But yeah, so we're done with bag 9. Bag 10 is the installation of the electronics and battery strap, wheels, tires, body. I'm not going to go too much into detail with trimming the body and painting it because I'm not very experienced with that, so I don't want to share any of my knowledge with you guys because I don't have much in that department. However, I will do a video, an unboxing video of the electronics, the speed controller and motor that I have for our spec class here, and the installation of that. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Please leave some comments about your experiences with this build, or if you have any tips for anyone else building this kit, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.